Thou preparest a table before me, wild harvest edibles, part 49. As you navigate any health challenge, it's always recommended that you partner with a medical practitioner that shares your philosophy of the care of the human body in disease and in health. The information shared in this presentation is meant to educate and improve your wellness toolbox and aid in returning to health if sick and maintaining good health when well. It should not be construed as medical advice, simply as tools that have been used successfully by others in similar situations. As always, investigate and verify any treatment, protocol, or procedure for yourself, not blindly accepting anything without due diligence. The doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will instruct his patient in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. Thomas Edison. Back in 1885, in a book called Counsels on Diets, as well as in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, Ellen White made this statement: "There are many ways of practicing the healing art, but there is only one way that heaven approves. God's remedies are the simple agencies of nature that will not tax or debilitate the system through their powerful properties. Pure air and water, cleanliness, a proper diet, purity of life, and a firm trust in God are remedies for the want of which thousands are dying. Yet these remedies are going out of date because their skillful use requires work that the people do not appreciate. Fresh air, exercise, pure water, and a clean, sweet premises are within the reach of all, with but little expense. But drugs are expensive, both in the outlay of means and the effect produced upon the system." We've been studying a little bit about the health message and learned that the role of hydrotherapy is huge in helping people with simple at-home remedies, that is the use of water. And it's one of those skills that requires time and some effort to learn about as one puts it into use. And it was duly noted that it actually works out very well for medical missionary work in sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, because you can't share the gospel in a hurry. If you give someone a pill, they pop it and they go away and they have an immediate result, whether that be good or bad, long-term negative or short-term positive or negative. But when you're using hydrotherapy, one of God's agencies, using water, it takes time. And giving the gospel in a way that people can understand and really appreciate does take time. So it's a great melding of the medical missionary work and the use of God's natural remedies. In 3 John 1 verse 2, it stated that, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers." Many times today, people are ill because of their conscience, because their soul is sick for a variety of different reasons, whether that be guilt or a lack of understanding about God, whatever it might be. We need to take care of our soul and seek for a proper understanding of God. And in prospering our soul, our health will also benefit. We still need to do the basic nutrition and exercise and fundamentals in those regards, but sometimes even with those being done, a sick soul can provide a sick body. Romans 12:1 and 2 says, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." We're admonished to provide a living sacrifice to God. A sacrifice was pure and perfect, without blemish. We are in a sin-marred world, but we can still do the best that we can to provide a living sacrifice, not a maimed and dead and dying sacrifice. That is unacceptable in God's sight. We need to do our best to do what God has called us to do and live the present truth of health reform that we have before us. Holy and acceptable to God. It's our reasonable service. It's not unreasonable to ask for those things. Obedience is the reasonable thing to do. God doesn't hold up some impossible bar for us to try to leap over. He can lift us over if we will choose to allow him to do that. And do not be conformed to this world. There's so many different ways that we can be conformed to this world, and the things we put into our minds and the things we put into our bodies. He has put before us every green tree, every herb bearing seed, the fruits of the vine in its unadulterated forms, and so many living things that provide for our health and benefit and welfare. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And part of what we're learning about is how our minds can be transformed by the things that we put into our bodies, that we can prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Our first plant that we'll look at today is Camas. There's a variety of different Camas. The blue Camas is the one that we'll be looking at in particular, but it emerges from an edible bulb that can be up to 28 inches tall. It has grass-like clusters. You can see those thick grass-like blades at the bottom there. And it grows in moist meadows, wet prairies, and stream sides. The one that we'll be looking at is the Camas, which is the sweetest of the varieties, and it grows from British Columbia down to California. There are a number of different other varieties too, Howleyi, Cusickii, Angusti, and Celoides, but those are less palatable, but all edible. Here's a gentleman walking across the field carrying some very healthy Camas that is at least 2 feet tall. So it can grow in large bunches. The arrangement of the flowers on the stem, they're star-shaped with 6 petals, very nicely lilac colored and various shades here. You can see the different lighting providing different contrasts of the color. Can take up entire meadow areas. You can see a nice wash of the blue color across these meadows here. They're grass-like in appearance. The leaves themselves up to 2 feet long and slender, pale green, and come up from a basal rosette. There used to be meadows of these back in the early days when the Native Americans were here, when the explorers were crossing the country. They were kept free of trees growing by prairie fires that the Native Americans would use to help maintain their Camas prairies. Once the Native Americans were no longer able to maintain the prairie areas with the fires, trees began to crowd in and come in closer over those prairies in many places and reduce those areas because Camas was a relied upon food source for the Native Americans. The edible part is the bulb. You can see some freshly picked bulbs here on the left and those that are prepared for consuming, eating on the right. Looks a little bit like an onion. They do have a papery skin over them, like an onion in that regard. They don't have an onion flavor or smell. So they harvest them while they're in bloom, or make sure you mark them while they're in bloom so that when you come to harvest them, you are getting the bulb that you are expecting. If you come and harvest in the fall, make sure that you wait until it has seeded itself. That way it's able to seed the next generation. So only harvest where it's abundant. Leave behind more plants than you harvest so that there is adequate reseeding and bulb preparation for the future harvest. It's high in a compound called Inulin. In its native state, it can cause bloating and gas. It has to be cooked first, and during that cooking process, it breaks it down into fructose. So it's cooked slow and low, and that breaks down the inulin into fructose and makes it very, very palatable. Pit roasting is an excellent method. You can also roast it in a Dutch oven over a fire and just clean that papery onion-like skin from it and cook it in 1-inch water for up to 2 days at about 200 degrees. So low and slow again. A slow cooker or a low pressure cooker would also be a way to do that. Check it every 12 hours. Make sure that you're not going to run it out of water and burn them. So use them like parsnips or sweet potatoes. Lewis and Clark mention the Camas as they crossed the west from the Midwest and the east to the Pacific coast. In 1806, Meriwether Lewis has in his journal that the Quamash is now in bloom. That's the variety that we see here, the Camas Quamash. And from the color, at a short distance, it resembles lakes of fine, clear water. So complete is this deception that on first sight I could have sworn it was water. So the blue Camas prairies were kept in fine form by the Native Americans as places where they could go and find food. So they had just come out of the Bitterroot Mountains in September of 1805, and they entered into the Nez Perce valleys, where the Nez Perce found their homes, and the Nez Perce offered them food, recognizing that they were very in dire need of that. Their supplies were low, and they gave them berries, dried buffalo, and salmon, and a bread that was prepared from the camas root. These were all primary agents of the Nez Perce diet. Clark and the rest of the voyage of discovery gorged themselves on the bread, calling it excellent and sweet, good and nourishing. However, not long after that, they became quite ill, probably because they had taken an empty stomach to food that they weren't used to consuming. And also, the camas, as we noted earlier, had inulin in it, and perhaps it wasn't cooked to the degree that was necessary for it to be most palatable for their digestive tracts. It also turns out that they noted that part of that was the bloating and gas that we mentioned earlier associated with the inulin, and there are notes in their journals of them creating quite a breaking of wind following the consumption of Camas. So one reason why you would want to mark the Camas in the field of Camas is that there may be poisonous lookalikes present, and the most deadly is the death Camas, Toxicodion venosum. Venosum, of course, referring to its deadly nature, has a very similar grass-like basal rosette to it, indistinguishable bulbs. The flower is the only way you can tell it difference, and sometimes they grow together. So the Native Americans were very diligent about finding them if they were present and uprooting them and eradicating them from their beds of blue camas so that they wouldn't mistakenly harvest them at a wrong time. The flowers are cream colored. They may smell like onion, but most of the time they don't. And it's important to make sure that you don't collect the death camas. So either mark it thoroughly when it's in bloom before harvesting the blue camas, or just only harvest it while it's in bloom. So the medicinal benefits of the blue camas, it can be helpful as a childbirth aid, as well as it can be a constituent of cough medicines. The next one is cat's ear, Hypocarius radicata. And Hypocarius radicata is also known as false dandelion or flatweed. I was pretty excited to find this in our list of edible plants because it's a very common constituent in many gardens. It has a distinct taproot that allows it to obtain moisture in the subsurface soil even when grass is completely dead and brown through the winter. You can see the lawn here, and not only in the winter, but in dry summer times. The lawn here is looking pretty peaked, but the cat's ear is very healthy and has very nice, wide, broad basal rosettes. You can see the bud there in the lower left and the closed blossom, which it closes during the day, and the full open flower, as well as the seed-bearing pod and its spent flower cluster. You can see it tightly packs down to the ground. It grows straight out and actually can kill the grass around it because it completely shades it out. So kind of a more loosely arranged flower cluster than the dandelion on a very long stems. This may be the only thing you're mowing sometimes in a lawn that it has this present during the summertime when the rest of the grass is dried up. So bright dandelion looking flower, notice it's on very tall stems. Those stems are solid and slender. Sometimes they branch into multiple flower clusters at the top. Like dandelion, they have a milky sap that's present, and it goes to seed in a similar way as the dandelion. But again, it has that long, spindly, solid stem. The leaf is a basal rosette. It has a long taproot, up to 8 inches long, the leaves are, and they're hairy and narrow at the base. Was able to taste one from our yard yesterday as I was preparing this presentation, and it's actually quite mild and quite tasty at this time of year, this presentation being done in the springtime before the flowers actually in March. So green with young leaves are very nice and green and tasty and tender. They tend to yellow and become less palatable with age. So the entire plant is edible, like the dandelion. You can use the flowers for garnishes and salads. You can use the roots for drink, for poultices, the leaves as a salad, green as a pot herb. Use it like spinach. The healthy plants that are blooming in full sun and a moist area are going to be the best tasting. As you cut them and harvest them, just dunk them in cold seawater or salt water for a better taste. And it's not as bitter as dandelion. It's much more palatable in that regard. So harvest the root when the plant is flowering. That has a long taproot you can see in the lower right diagrams. A hot drink from the cat's ear, you want to gather the roots and wash them thoroughly. Chop them into small pieces and you can dry them in the sun. You can do them just overnight or through the afternoon, just in a nice dry location, or you can dry roast them in a cast iron pot for up to 4 hours over a fire. You don't want to burn them, but you want to dry roast them. Then grind or pulverize the roots. You can use a mortar and pestle or other hard surfaces to grind them up. And then once you have the powder, steep 1 tablespoon of roasted root in 2 cups of boiling water. Once it's been roasted or steeped, then go ahead and strain it into a mug, and you can sweeten it with honey if you wish. The mug on the right is a great mug of tea, but you'll notice that the dandelion is actually being shown there, and rather than the cat's ear, but very similar plants. And this is in a period of time and on the ground there where the leaves are leaf litter looks like oak and maple there on the ground. So it's a wild, caffeine-free beverage, like many roasted grain or roasted root beverages like chicory, for example, also. Some medicinal properties associated with cat's ear can aid digestion, can help to level out blood sugar, and it may have some detoxification roles in a similar fashion to dandelion. Not as much as has been recorded with respect to cat's ears, but it's in the same family, Asteraceae, has a similar presentation, similar saps, and very likely having very similar properties to dandelion. Again, you can review this at www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com and find other archived similar presentations.